Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We see that people are joining us still. We're going to give it just a few more seconds so that all participants can get connected, and then we will get started. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for connecting and for joining us at this webinar on breaking down gender biases, shifting social norms towards gender equality, organized by the Human Development Report Office and the Gender Team at the United Nations Development Program. So today we're going to discuss how, without tackling biased gender norms, we will not be able to achieve gender equality nor reach the Sustainable Development Goals. But what is the status of gender norms across the world today, and how can we really work in practice to shift these norms towards gender equality? We're going to hear from a great group of speakers on these topics, and you're also going to have the opportunity to ask your questions to all our speakers. So before we jump in, let me just introduce myself. My name is Josephine Paasonen, and I'll be moderating the seminar today. Please feel free to use also the chat function to introduce yourselves and comment on the discussions as we go along. We'll have 2 moments for questions and answers with our speakers. So please feel free to also use the Q&A function for all your questions to the speakers, and we'll try to bring them up as we go along. Now, to open the webinar, we have Pedro Conceição, who's the director of the Human Development Report Office at UNDP, and Raquel Lagunas, who is the head of the gender team here at UNDP. So without further ado, Pedro, please, the floor is yours. And after that, do hand over directly to Raquel.
Thank you so much, Josephine. Thank you, Raquel, and your team for joining us and co-organizing this webinar today, and for all the discussants. My colleague Rianne is going to present the findings in a bit, so I just wanted to say a couple of words about the motivation in the Human Development Report Office for undertaking this effort to quantify gender-biased social norms. Just a bit of context, the Human Development Report Office has been working on gender inequality for many years. We started, in fact, in 1995, introducing indices of gender inequality. But we've always tried to update them, refine our metrics of gender inequality, expand them to keep up with policy challenges and the knowledge that has been accumulated about challenges associated with gender inequality. But there are particularly 2 aspects that have motivated our work on quantifying gender social norms. First, the fact that if we look at the context, we are witnessing widespread backlash against gender equality, not everywhere, but in many places. And even reversals in some of the progress in closing gender gaps. And this has been exacerbated during and in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that many women in most countries were hardest hit by the economic recessions, in part because they were overrepresented in some of the sectors that were more affected by the lockdowns, but also because we saw the reaffirmation of gender social norms with implications on women withdrawing from the labor force to fulfill social expectations on care, for instance. So this was the first motivation, a context in which we're seeing reversals and backlash on some of the progress that had been achieved over many years on some indicators, at least, of gender equality. And the second motivation was an asymmetry or a difference between progress in some areas, some aspects of gender equality, and stagnation or reversal in other areas. Rian will probably speak to one of the findings in our report, where we show that while gender gaps in education, for instance, have narrowed on average in most countries, and in many, women today are actually more educated than men, that has not closed the gender gaps in income and earnings. And our report also shows that when women reach positions of power, there are both positive effects and negative effects on gender equality. There are two forces, and the net effect can go either way. On the one hand, there are positive effects on the elimination of stereotypes and role models when women reach these positions of power. But there are also potential negative effects, given that women can be subject to more scrutiny than men. So all of these are just two illustrations of the motivation to collect data, both on gender gaps, on empowerment, on outcomes, but also on gender social norms. So just in conclusion, our motivation is driven by the belief that data on gender social norms is critical to inform policy and advocacy that is effective in a comprehensive way, and also avoids counterproductive interventions where we may have advances in one dimension that may go along with reversals in others. So once again, we are very grateful for all the colleagues co-organizing and joining us today in presenting and discussing the report, and most importantly, all of you for listening. We're looking forward to your feedback, your comments, and you can count on the Human Development Report Office at UNDP to continue to expand our work on gender and broader human development indices going forward. Thank you, Josephine.
Thank you. So let me hand over right away to Raquel Lagunas, who is our head of the gender team at UNDP. Raquel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Pedro. Welcome to all of you, all the participants. And first of all, big recognition and congratulations to our Human Development Report colleagues, Pedro at the head, and all the team that was one day thinking how important it is to understand this non-tangible part of inequalities. And they produced these gender social norms that they have updated. And we are very, very proud and happy with our collaboration. So as Pedro said, the number of people holding bias is incredibly, and the progress is incredibly disappointing, is very slow. So to add, many parts of the world, movements against gender equality are growing, have gained ground, and women's rights are being rolled back. So this backlash is fed by and feeds also negative bias and social norms. So the conversation that we are going to have today is very relevant for everybody who is committed and working to advance women's rights and gender equality and human development for UNDP. So for us, for our organization, it became very crucial to understand much better how power relations and negative norms are shaping individuals, but also institutions. And these institutions are the ones setting up the access and control over resources, over well-being at the end. So our gender equality strategy, it is the first time, the one that has been approved 1.5 years ago, that is establishing as a clear priority to support countries dismantling these long-standing social norms and harmful stereotypes. So the data that our Office of Human Development report is producing is fundamental for the work of our offices to open meaningful conversations about how social hierarchies, discrimination, power relationships are maintained and sustained, of course, through the process of socialization, as we all know, right? That the process of socialization is the one helping to construct these imaginary and identities, but also how we can link this big kind of component of social norms to public policies. So the goal today is give visibility to this reality. As Pedro said, and our colleague here will talk by far more and better, they will explain and showcase how these social beliefs can really obstruct gender equality in multiple dimensions, in policy, education, economy, even physical integrity. But the goal is to find solutions. So I just wanted to share and close here that, of course, data will not change alone, right, the reality. So for UNDP is fundamental to support governments and develop a next generation, what we call still next generation of public policies that intentionally target this gender bias and social norms. I think Pedro gave some examples, but we know how, for instance, in countries where they have paternity leave, this is a big driver of change in perceptions and awareness. There are other examples that we will provide. So I encourage all of you here today to reflect, to listen to the presentations, of course, but to think in the way forward. How do you see that this lack of progress can be addressed? So we can open a conversation where we co-create this thinking forward about gender equality and social norms, because we are not talking just about a merely gender gap, we are talking about a power gap. So over to you. Thank you so much for joining us, for joining UNDP in this conversation. Over.
Thank you very much, Raquel, and thank you again, Pedro, as well, for those opening words, and for encouraging also all our participants in this webinar to reflect on these issues, to comment and post your questions in the chat and the Q&A, so that we really get a conversation going around the topics of gender norms. Now we're going to move over to a brief presentation of the 2023 Gender Social Norms Index report. And to do so, I'm going to invite my colleague Rehana Mohammed, who is a research fellow at the Human Development Report Office. Rehana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Josephine, and thank you, everyone. My name is Rehana. I'm on the research team that was behind this report. And we've been very gratified by the level of interest in the work itself and just how much the findings have resonated. So very glad to see so many people here today. Our work on gender social norms began in 2019. And the idea behind it, in addition to what Pedro explained in his remarks earlier, the idea is to shed light on how social beliefs and attitudes can work as persistent barriers to making progress for women and girls. And the way that we try to do this is through the Gender Social Norms Index. And what it does is that it quantifies biases against women. It captures people's attitudes on women's roles in society along 4 dimensions. You'll see them up here: political, educational, economic, and physical integrity. Each dimension has 1 or 2 indicators. The data itself is drawn from the World Values Survey. This latest edition of the GSNI uses data going up to January of 2023. It covers 80 countries and territories, and together that accounts for around 85% of the world's population. The indicators are drawn from the survey questions. And the core GSNI value, the numbers that you'll see in much of the rest of this presentation, is essentially a percentage. We try to measure the percentage of people with at least 1 bias. So the value itself can range from 0 to 1. and higher GSNI values indicate higher bias against gender equality. Using the GSNI, we know that gender biases are pervasive around the world. Around 90% of people have at least one bias against women. And the way that you can see this on this chart is if you look right all the way on the right side, we've stacked each block counts the number of people with at least one bias, at least two, at least three. And if you stack them all together, you get a number. We arrive at 90% of people say. And these biases emerge in areas that are fundamental for women's progress. Let me try to move this slide. Oops. And so I'm having a bit of trouble with this. Got it. Sorry about that. The biases emerge in areas that are fundamental for upholding women's rights and for realizing their full potential. We find that today nearly half of people believe that men make better political leaders than women. More than 2 out of 5 believe that men make better business executives. And a quarter of people believe that it is justifiable for a man to beat his wife. And all of these matter because it makes an enormous difference to the everyday realities of women's lives. For instance, it means that when women are trying to go to school, when they go to work, when they try to enter politics, they're doing this in a world where most people think that they are less capable, and most people tolerate unequal treatment between men and women. And while this is clearly detrimental to women themselves, it also is detrimental to society more broadly, because when women are able to participate as equals, it's communities also that stand to gain, not just women themselves. And when social norms work against women's full potential, we all stand to lose out. Biases are widespread among both men and women in all dimensions of GSNI. Around 87% of women and 90% of men have at least one gender bias. The data also allows us to see changes in gender social norms over time. And when we compare to the last edition of the GSNI, we see that overall, there has been no improvement in biases against women in the past decade. So today, just as many people, that's close to 90%, hold fundamental biases against women when compared to the 2010 to 2014 period when we first computed the GSNI. And this is significant because this stagnation is occurring at a time when we've seen many powerful local, global campaigns for women's rights in these areas. And that the GSNI value changed so little over this time shows how persistent social norms can be. And it speaks to this context of backlash that both Pedro and Raquel talked about earlier at the session. So that is the overall picture. At the global level, stagnation. But within some countries, and there's 38 countries up here on the screen, the GSNI data allows us to do a comparison over time. And looking at these countries, the index shows that in some places we have seen an improvement. In 27 countries, the share of people that have no bias actually rose between the two periods that the GSNI was computed. But in other countries, the 11 countries you see in green at the bottom of this chart, in 11 countries, the share of people with no bias shrunk. Without tackling gender bias social norms, we will not be able to achieve gender equality as called for in the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is in part because biased social norms can continue to impede women's empowerment and progress, even in settings where women have made, even in settings where there has been improvement in basic rights and capabilities. And using the GSNI data, we show how this happens in two areas that are fundamental for women's empowerment. One is in education. And in the report, we present new evidence that the link between women's progress in education to the closing of the gap in education between men and women, the link between that and women's economic empowerment might be broken. And what this means is that while usually we would expect that closing the gender education gap should reduce gender income gaps. Instead, what we're seeing is today, even in places where women are more educated and more skilled than ever before, and in places where women are more educated than men, the gap in economic empowerment still persists. So there's 57 countries where adult women are more educated than men. And in those countries, the average income gap between men and women is 39%. And what this figure shows is how the association between the gap in income and the gap in education has evolved since 1990. And what you can see is that previously the two were closely linked and positive above the green line on this chart. But in recent years, so as we move towards the right, the link between them has declined to zero, which is suggesting that more recently, the increases in educational achievements for women has not been translating into better economic outcomes and opportunities for women. And this means that we can no longer explain gender gaps in income by looking at education alone. Instead, we find that using the GSNI data, there is a much stronger link between women's economic empowerment and social norms. So we show that in countries that have the highest level of gender biases, as measured by the GSNI, women spend, for instance, over 6 times as much time on men on domestic chores and care work. In countries with the lowest level of biases, there's still a gap. On average, women still spend double the amount of time as men do on care work and domestic chores. And this evidence is in line with a much larger body of work showing that women's incomes are severely impacted by the burden of care work. And that comes from a social expectation and social norms that call on women to spend more time on care work than men do. We also show, or we also have some evidence showing how gender social norms might be impacting women's roles in politics, where we have seen stark inequalities between men and women. At the highest level of political leadership, that is, in being heads of state or heads of government, the number or proportion of heads of state or government for women has remained around 10% since 1995. And this is in a context where women have the right to vote and run for office virtually everywhere in the world. And so most legal or formal barriers to women's holding office have been removed to a large extent. And so we suggest that gender biases and social norms might be playing a role here, particularly norms that position women as less capable leaders than men, norms that support stigmatization of women in politics. And these can all shed light on why women still face an uphill battle when it comes to attaining political power. The GSNI data does show that when women do become leaders, social norms can change, but this change can go in either direction, towards greater acceptance of women's leadership or greater backlash against women, which also reflects the sort of tendency for women leaders to be judged more harshly than their male counterparts. That said, all of that said, social norms are not easy to change, but this does not mean that gender biases are immovable. And in the report, we discuss 2 levels of change, and under each, we suggest a range of things that we can do. And the first lever is to drive change towards greater equality across the board through policy and institutional reform. For instance, through laws and policies that promote equality, through insurance mechanisms that strengthen social protection and care systems for women, the idea being to increase women's power and agency and help them anticipate and face risk and contingency. We can also invest in more innovative interventions that challenge harmful social norms and attitudes. For instance, interventions that combat online hate speech or gender disinformation. Alongside that, we also need to directly address social norms through intervening in social contexts and settings where these attitudes and beliefs are formed. For instance, One area is education, where we suggest that the content of education can help to shape social norms and values related to gender. Recognition efforts that recognize the rights of women in all spheres of life and change how we talk about gender social norms and the roles of women in society. And the third is that we can also work to improve women's representation, particularly to ensure that they achieve parity in political voice and decision-making, and by supporting women's agency at large. These are not impossible to achieve because we know that gender social norms have changed in the past. For example, there is now much more social acceptance of expanding education for girls, for women going to work, for women having access to contraceptives, for instance. And while UNDP has an important role to play in developing what Raquel alluded to, the next generation of public policies that target gender-biased social norms, it's also possible for most anyone to recognize and change biased social norms, and that's something that we can all start doing today. I'll leave us with that, and we are looking forward to questions and of course this. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Rehana, and also for leaving us with those very encouraging words that we all have a role to play in shifting biased gender norms. As we've seen in the report, we all, well, 9 out of 10 people, right, carry sort of biased gender norms. So this is a collective sort of effort to work towards gender equality. Now, you talked about how, despite the fact that we've made quite a lot of advances in women's education, economic opportunities, health for women, and so on, the shares of heads of state and government who are women has remained around 10% worldwide since 1995, and women hold just over a quarter of parliamentary seats globally. So why are we not making more progress in terms of gender equality and political leadership? And what roles do gender norms play, and how are they important when it comes to gender equality and political leadership? To comment on this, let me turn now to Rachel George, who is a lecturing fellow at the Duke Center for International Development and who has done quite a lot of work on these issues. So Rachel, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Josephine, and all the colleagues, Raquel, Rehana, Pedro. It's just a delight to be here and to have this GSNI resource. So I'm really grateful to have the chance to use it and really think about it with you all today. I'm just going to share some slides. Please just let me know if that works. Can you see those slides? I can't see you, so I hope that means you can. Yes, just.
We are not seeing your slides yet, I'm afraid.
Can you see them now?
Yes, here we go.
Perfect, thank you. Yes, so as Josephine mentioned, I mean, that was such a helpful overview of all of the interconnected ways we can think about gender norms and gender norm change and what we can really do to try and shift those norms. And as Josephine mentioned, my work really focuses on the political space. So I was hoping today to really dig into some of what that means, what that looks like around the world. But as we know, even for women in politics, these are really interconnected questions. So the educational, economic, sort of violence-based barriers that shape the normative space that women politicians can then operate in is really critical. So I'm thrilled to have colleagues today who I know will dig into those dimensions as well. So let's jump in with some good news. As others have mentioned, there is a lot of progress to celebrate. Unfortunately, there's always a but, so the next slides get a little bit more into the challenges. But here you'll see on the left-hand side, I pulled a sort of headline from the United Nations in March 2023. So this year, this exciting headline that for the first time, women were represented in all parliaments around the world. And indeed, that's big news. I mean, it's taken decades, over a century of progress to even have women incorporated as full citizens in most countries around the world. In my country, in the United States, it's been a century of change, but it wasn't until 2015 that Saudi Arabia was the last nation to formally sort of ban women from the political space in a formalized way. And in fact, the troubling news we're seeing today in Afghanistan is striking, given that in 1919, women were afforded the right to vote. So it's been many, many years of struggle, but also many years of progress. And you can see on the right-hand side that indeed, norms are changing. Norms can and do change. And the outlier cases on the right-hand side, you can see there are situations in a number of countries where representation is actually close to parity. So in some ways, that's great news. We see sort of the equal representation of women, nearly on balance to represent what we see in society at large. And that's progress, as you can see. Unfortunately, it's quite small, but on the bottom left-hand side, those bars, those colored bars, were really small. Around the time of the Beijing Declaration, it was, exciting maybe to see 20%, 30% of women in legislative bodies and parliaments. And today we do see cases, they're not the norm, but there are these cases of near parity. However, unfortunately, I did mention that there is bad news too. And as we know, the average is still relatively small, so only about a quarter of women around the world have representation in a quarter of parliaments have women's representation, have women in those seats, and heads of state and head of government is really small. And I pulled these from the GSNI report, which is really helpful. We also know that gender norms are really associated with these cases where women are really excluded from the political space. The problem is, even in spaces where there are a lot of women we see in politics, we know that doesn't mean they're treated equally. So this is exactly what the GSNI, I think, is helping us think about. And this is this idea of normative barriers. So let's break that down for a second and think about, what are these gendered social norms? What is really behind the fact that women, if they get into politics, they might not be treated the same way, or they might not be able to get there in the first place, to rise to head of state, even if they're 25% in the parliament. Why are they 10% in the head of state role? So I wanted to point you to this conceptual framework my colleagues and I have been working on at the Overseas Development Institute and at Duke, where we think about norm change. And I'll point you to two quick elements here. The first is the yellow section sort of towards the middle here. And this is this idea that norm change really filters through multiple levels if you think about change. So this is drawing on the socio-ecological model, this idea that it's the wider systems and enabling environment, it's the policies, it's the community, it's the individual, family, household level that all filter norm change. And unfortunately, often in the political space, you'll see, we turn to these blunt tools like quotas that will say, let's impose 30, 40, 50% seats in certain political bodies that should be devoted to women, but often we don't see the norm change that can fully filter just through that policy space. It's really where we start to see the cracks in the wider environment, if it's the systems, if it's the violence that the female politicians and harassment might face once they're there, the community base, the individual barriers. So we really see the idealized norm change flow to follow across all those levels. That really is a call to action to think about programming that takes into account multi-level change and multi-level interventions. And I'll point you to one other element here, which is the green at the bottom, which again, my colleagues at the UNDP office introduced a bit of, is this idea that norm change and outcome level change are really interconnected. So you need norm change to drive representation. So you need this idea that women can have the potential to be leaders, to enable people to feel able to vote for women, to run for office. But at the same time, you have this interrelationship with the outcome level change. So as colleagues mentioned, seeing women in roles of leadership can normalize the idea that it's possible. It can also lead to backlash. So you need to be thinking about norm change as a driver of outcome level change, but outcome level change also as a driver of norm change. And I think that complexity is really important to think about. And there are many stereotypes that you might think about in these areas. I'll just pull two quotes from research we've done in Nepal. Women parliamentarians there told us that there's no trust over women even when they reach office. If we look at decision-making levels, women's presence isn't a priority. They're seen as only there for fulfilling a quota. Another parliamentarian mentioned when meetings end, media personnel direct their cameras and mics towards the male parliamentarians. Some female members are bluntly ignored. So that's where you see, you know, the norm change isn't filtering through. You might get the women in the room, but then they can't have a voice, or the cameras turn to someone else. So that's where we need to be really trying to, in a context-specific way, think about those barriers. So just in my last few minutes, I thought I'd bring a few more complexity points and then bring us to some potential solutions. So as the GSNI highlights this really strong association between norms and outcomes, it's important, I think, to think about that last layer, the green boxes of where these relationships are complex. So I'll point you to 2 dots on this rather complicated graph. On the x-axis, we mapped attitudes. So this is World Values Surveys data that looks at the question, do men make better political leaders? And then on the y-axis, you see outcome level data from the IPU, how many women are in parliament? And often these are very related, but we have these interesting outliers. So there's a case like Uruguay, where the sexist attitude report is actually relatively low. So not many of the population at least admit in these surveys to believing that men make better political leaders. But in this case, the share of female parliamentarians isn't very high. So even though the sexist attitude has been potentially whittled away, there are other barriers in the space that are financial, economic, educational. It might be part of this sort of violence that we need to think about in that context. What is it that's driving the barrier across those multiple levels? And equally on the other side, we see the opposite. So there are cases where the sexist attitude is really high, but representation is also relatively high. I mean, cases like Tunisia are interesting, where there's really high reports of sexist attitudes, but actually the share of female parliamentarians is greater than the average. Or, you know, places like Rwanda, which are these really interesting cases with pretty hefty quotas. And that's where I think we have to think about the blunt policy tools aren't working. They're not cracking the norms behind it. So it's a complicated charge, but I think understanding and unpicking that work through the GSNI and other resources like this is really, really critical. Penultimate slide here is just the point that I know my colleague raised, which I think is so important, that change is not linear. So this is on the left-hand side from the GSNI, this really important point about social norm change not being one directional. We see improvements, reductions in biases across the board, which is great in many cases, but not all, and norms do harden and get worse. And similarly, we did similar research with attitudes towards women in politics. And we saw the same thing. So overall, since about 1995, in the time of the Beijing Declaration, you saw a fairly good reduction, you know, minus 15 percentage point. It would be great to have a lot more, but there was an overall reduction in general of sexist attitudes towards that, that viewpoint. However, there are cases that today, there are contexts where people think men make better political leaders more today than they did in the past. And that's really troubling. I think that's something we need to really unpick and understand what's driving that hardening of attitudes. So what can we do? This is an important charge for all of us, I think, on the call. And I think, Rahima said it really well. It's really getting to the meat of the social norms behind this, because, as this sector really shows, just getting women in the room is never enough. So there's no one silver bullet, unfortunately, but to the point of the multi-level change, I think that's where we can maybe today start to talk about what are these cross-sectoral interventions that can kind of get at these wider context-specific barriers. And I threw up a few quick thoughts today, which I'd love to hear from others of how they think about this. The first is on violence prevention and protection. I think we have some great people today who are going to speak about this. There's a act right now in India, the POSH Act, that's under consideration, where they're looking at political parties as workplaces that deserve the same workplace protections. There's mentoring and education initiatives. There's skills training and capacity building initiatives. And there's support for women's groups and movements, cross-party women's working groups, and that really look at the specific context and see what are these sectoral barriers and how can we tackle them. So I'm excited to hear from others today, and thank you so much for the opportunity to reflect on this great resource.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So before we jump into the next session on this webinar, let me just quickly pull up some questions that have been coming in from the audience, and maybe this one for you to reflect on, Rachel, from Susan Tellingater. When you discuss these studies of sort of women political leadership, are there studies related to substantive representation versus symbolic representation? Susan is saying, I think where representation is high due to quotas, for example, perhaps there is minimal substantive representation. So how would you reflect on that? And then maybe one question to Rihanna on the report and the findings in the report on the policy side. How can you really work, from Martha Kimbagle, can you really work with gender equality in contexts when women also carry biased gender social norms? It seems perhaps a bit contradictory that women would carry biased gender social norms. So is there anything in the report that discusses this? But first Rachel and then Rihanna.
Sure, yeah, thank you so much. It's a really great question. And I think there's a fair amount of work that's looking this idea of substantive versus symbolic representation. And the idea of substantive representation, I think, is really important. So women will get in the room and become sidelined. There's a lot of studies of ministerial roles, so where women might be pigeonholed to certain sectoral work. So they might be asked to work on an education in a ministry of education and sort of lead that, but not in something that's security-based or sort of working on nuclear policy or economic policy. And that's where you start to see the numbers of outcome level representation data doesn't match meaningful political representation. And in fact, there's all sorts of discrimination, sort of failure to represent all sorts of groups in these ways that you see shaking out. So the numbers need to really be unpicked to think about substantive, meaningful representation. What does that mean and what drives it? So I think it's a really great question. And I have a few reports I can maybe pop in the chat that might be helpful, but it's absolutely, I think, the crux of what this work needs to be thinking about.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Over to Rihanna.
Thanks, Justin, also for the question. I think that's a question we have heard a lot and thought about a fair bit while doing this work. And it speaks to, I think...
Sorry, Rihanna, we're not hearing you really well.
Sorry, is it? No, I didn't do anything different, but is this better at all?
Unfortunately not.
Is this at all?
Hi, no, not really. Maybe we can come back.
What is happening, but I'm gonna
oh, there we go. There we go.
So did that work?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm so sorry about that. I'm not sure what that was. But what I was saying is that one of the findings in the report is precisely that both men and women hold biases. And it's not, and that is because these biases are sort of socially incubated, socially learned. And the way that happens is by creating a set of beliefs that is widespread among a lot of people, that is institutionalized. And to this idea that women themselves hold these biases, that is true. But I think it's also worth noting that women hold these biases in a context that makes it difficult for women to articulate their own priorities and needs as well. So it's not simply that women innately have these biases. We have to recognize that it's in a context where women are not that empowered to speak, to even think differently about their situations, to aspire to other things. And so I'd say a big part of the solution in that respect has to be in increasing women's voice and agency and their influence over policymaking in particular. And that is a big part of both changing how men see the role of women and changing how women see their own roles in society as well.
Right, right. Thank you. Thank you very much for that, both of you, Rihanna and Rachel. We're going to move on now to the second part of this webinar, where we're actually going to dig a little bit deeper into what can be done then in this context, as you're describing, Rihanna, where a lot of people are carrying biased gender norms, and where perhaps women's agency in particular is constrained by these biased norms that are then reproduced and kind of may limit how well they can articulate their own aspirations and be sort of the agents of change of their own lives. So in this quite challenging setting, what is UNDP doing on shifting gender social norms, and what can UNDP do? To discuss this, we now have Aroa Santiago, who's a gender specialist in inclusive economies at the gender team. Aroa, please, the floor is yours. Aroa, I'm not sure. I don't think we are hearing you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you. Thank you very much.
Okay, my screen froze. I don't know if you're seeing my screen at all.
We're seeing that you started screen sharing, but we're not seeing your slides, I'm afraid.
You're not seeing them. Okay, because I have the whole screen frozen. So I think I'm just gonna go like this because it doesn't seem to be working. So, so what has been presented so far is critical because we need to understand what is happening and what the biases, the gender social norms are. But it is also critically important to be able to target them, address them. So with our current gender equality strategy, one of the things that we are prioritizing is exactly targeting the economic and the social structures that generate discrimination. So, it seems I recover now my screen. I think you may be able to see it now.
Yes.
Can you?
Yes.
Okay. we got it. So, as I was saying that we aim to target the economic and the social structures that generate discriminations. This includes targeting social norms per se, but this also includes targeting elements in the economy and elements in digital strategies, in national, in the green transition that also affect gender social norms. As an example, in 2022, we worked in 108 countries together with women's or feminist organizations to help transform these social norms and to help empower opening these civic spaces. And and there were 271 initiatives that we supported to prevent gender-based violence, targeting specifically these harmful gender social norms. But one of the things that we think is the most relevant is to connect all the things that we know that work to transform social norms with policy. This is how we can bring it to scale once it is embedded on the national policies. So what we do is precisely to help embed this lens on what the social norms are and how they can be transformed within tax policies, fiscal policy, within the digital strategy, social protection, but we also help rethink how economies work, how societies work. So how can we redefine the paid and unpaid employment? How can we rethink other metrics that are not GDP that can help capture things that the GDP doesn't capture? How can we help prevent gender-based violence through online violence and addressing disinformation and hate speech? For this, we do it with governments. We work a lot with parliaments on addressing disinformation, for example. We work through different ministries to address it. So I can put just a couple of examples. One example, this is to generate this data that the GSNI has generated, but to have it in countries in real time. So to help policymakers, but also help civil society understand the real-time context and to understand where interventions are needed. What you're seeing here is a prototype that it is online and that we tested in Colombia, Philippines, and Uganda. The metrics that it's using are the metrics of the Gender Social Norms Index. So you can see that it is measuring, analyzing, in this case, Twitters or the X, but it can be applied to any other social media. And it is monitoring biases, hate speech on education, politics, reproductive rights, violence, and employment. Here we have the example of Uganda, that within the last, within a scope of some months, it was employment that had more tweets registered. And you can see the tweets with hate speech. They were 9.9% of them. So with this information, we have been working with governments, for example, to develop strategies on preventing hate speech, or also on raising awareness. For example, in India, we see that UNDP, together with the government of India, designed a behavioral insights framework to support practitioners in designing and implementing interventions to help build more equal sharing of unpaid care work between women and men. Or we also see in Mexico that Mexico's National Electoral Institute created a community of practice with the support of UNDP. So there were 3,200 public servants trained on gender-based violence and non-violent masculinities for realizing women's human rights. So we see that there is a lot of work that we can do when we understand where gender social norms are in advocacy and in prevention, in training, in capacity development, but also in trying to reshape and change economies and rechange how we are doing digital transition, green transition, in a way that really help reduce these biases and help empower women and girls. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aroa, and please do stay on if you can to see if we have any questions, any pressing questions on the audience, from the audience, on sort of what can really be done and how we're working to shift biased gender social norms. But first, we're going to hear from practices from civil society to change social norms, because civil society is, of course, crucial in the work of trying to achieve gender equality. So how is civil society working in a context with pervasive and biased gender social norms on very challenging issues such as violence against women? Let me first turn to Natsnet Gebreibran, who's the director of the Violence Against Women Preventing team at Raising Voices. Natsnet, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Josephine. I just want to check if you are able to hear me and see my screen.
Yes, we are. Thank you very much.
All right. So I'm very happy that I'm here taking part in the conversation around social norms, and add a bit of content based on the work that we are doing at Raising Voices. To do so, I will be giving a short overview of the approach, the SASA Together approach, and use that as a point of reflection around experience and journey towards addressing social norms. So just allow me to... Sorry, my cursor has frozen. SASA Together is a community mobilization approach to preventing violence against women. SASA means now in Kiswahili, and it really flags the urgency to addressing violence against women as like a kind of an emergency, an urgent issue, and together represents that change is possible, but it really requires collaborative approach and solidarity and support. This approach is developed by raising voices, and it's being used by multiple organizations, diverse and multiple organizations across the globe, starting from Latin America all the way to the Pacific, and using it in diverse contexts in humanitarian and development context. Just before I go and speak about SASA together, I also want to talk briefly about the genesis and evolution of SASA. As you can see, there are three guides or resources on my screen. The first one is SASA. This is the one that was developed originally, and it was piloted in Uganda, and in partnership with CEDOVIP, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and Makerere, and it has proven to be effective in reducing the risk of physical intimate partner violence by 52%. It's quite effective. And we have rolled it out into so many countries. And then the second one is SASA phase. It is an adaptation of SASA to engage faith community, Christian and Muslim community, to really think about power and violence against women and prevent violence against women in their context. The last one is SASA Together, which was launched in 2020. SASA Together is a revision of SASA based on a decade-long of experience and learning of using SASA in multiple countries. So my presentation will be referring to SASA, but it's a cumulative learning and experience of the different versions of SASA. So as we mentioned, SASA Together seeks to change our norms. Norms, we see them as beliefs about what is considered appropriate within a given community or a given society or group. Usually it's unwritten, and it helps us to decide and show up in life and how we show up in life. It's reinforced and monitored by community members themselves. Like earlier, we were talking about like how women are also upholding some of the negative social norms. So everyone really holds those norms because it is all about socializations we have as we grow up in the society. And it's held by individuals, like as group or like as people, and it's also embedded in the structures and systems of various institutions that exist in our society. And we recognize preventing violence against women involves social norm change. And what are some of the norms that SASA Together tries to address towards preventing and nurturing violence-free society and space for women? A woman must have sex whenever her partner wants to. And another norm is violence is an expected part of marriage. It's really normalized. It's taken as part and parcel of life. What happens in family must stay in family. And this really, really challenges the support seeking and talking about violence in public spaces. Husbands should discipline their partners. This is a true reflection of power imbalance, like women's and becoming like a huge barrier for women to exercise their agency and power. And then another norm is men must be financial providers for the family. So I know there are so many other harmful social norms. This is just to mention some. And recognizing that, SASA Together really encourages individuals, community, and institution to question what is considered normal and acceptable. Like we said, like they are considered as part and parcel of normal life, but it really facilitates critical thinking to question what is normal. And it also talks about power and creates a space where we can really rethink our power relations in our relationships, in our relationship, intimate relationship, and broadly in our community, how women show up in political space, like financial sectors and different spaces. Just to give you a quick picture of how SASA operates. SASA Together is a phased-in approach. As you can see here, it has 4 phases based on the theory of behavior change. The process is structured in a way it's easy to navigate. Someone was mentioning that change is not linear. Yeah, it is not, it's quite complex, but SASA tries to kind of create and help navigate and through that change process. So we have 4 phases: start, awareness, support, and action. These are also the acronym to SASA. And it is based on recognition that violence against women exists because of the power imbalances that are manifested in relationships between men and men. And because of that, it really unpacks power in the change process. It talks about the different forms of power, but it also organizes that reflection and unpacking to the phases. For example, in START, community are really supported to foster their power within by thinking about like how everyone has power. And when communities transition or the program transition to awareness, everyone comes together to critically think about the power over, like how men's power over is the root cause of violence against women. And then in support phase, with a recognition that violence against women really requires a collective power, a community really bring together their power, they build their collective power to addressing violence against women and also supporting women who are experiencing violence. And finally, on the action, like community members as a group, as individuals, or as an institution, they use their power to create change and sustain change towards violence against women prevention. And then across the 4 phases, there is holistic engagement, because we said earlier, like it requires holistic engagement across the ecological model. So there are 3 strategies: local activism, community leadership, and institutional strengthening, because we also said that institutions are also a way of sustaining those harmful norms. So eventually, as an outcome, we expect when we engage communities through this process, violence against women will not be acceptable. It will not be normalized. And then there is a new belief that women can live safer and a dignified and fulfilling life. So just to unpack a bit about the holistic engagement, who is engaged? In SASA Together, there are 3 layers of circles of influence. The inner circle is about interpersonal and individual, where community activists are engaging people who are around their life, like friends, neighbors, and family members, to really think about power and think about violence and their relationship. And then the second one is community leadership, where community leaders really use their platform and their power to influence positive social change process. And then finally is identifying allies from selected institutions, where they can really think about the organizational culture and then also develop policies, guidelines, and laws that really helps to nurture a positive social norm within their organization and eventually spills into the community. So it's all about engaging everyone across the ecological model. When we also say everyone, it's men and women, like religious leaders, really thinking about who are the influential people, who should we really engage, and leaving no one behind towards building critical mass. And this process is really led by community. Like when we talk about local activism, these are like ordinary people, women and men, who are passionate about this issue, and using like identifying leaders who are also committed to nurturing positive social norm change towards preventing violence against women. So that when we engage these people and then they engage their circles, the new ideas, the positive norms can diffuse across the society. And how does it happen? In SASA Together, when engagement with communities happen, it's not about telling people what to do and what not to do. It's about asking critical questions. Questioning in a way, it facilitates individual and critical thinking. Like, for example, okay, we all have power. We said, like, if we have power, how are we using our power? Are we using it positively or negatively? So really, really helping people to think through their behaviors, their attitudes, and then come up with their own solutions. And there is also a dedication and intention towards benefit-based approach. It's about engaging community members to envision how the new norms, the positive norms, could really benefit everyone in their society. So once they have that positive vision, they will be able to really feel motivated to embrace change in their individual and collective spaces. And so like in SASA Together, there is a recognition that for social change to happen, there should be intensity. It's not just one time of training. It's not just one day drama in a year. It's about using diverse strategy. Like, for example, we have 3 strategies, and each strategy has multiple activities. So using those strategies and then also using various and diverse activity, so community members have the opportunity to get these new ideas from multiple sources, and when they are exposed from multiple sources, they are really encouraged to think and start thinking and engaging about this new idea.
Thank you. Sorry, Naznat, can I just ask you to start wrapping up in the interest of time?
Okay, great. This is my last slide. So what are we learning from our journey? Social norm change requires sustained and intensive programming, and it has also to be done in a way people can relate it with their life. It has to be personal and it has to be provocative. And as NGOs or as an organization, we should really think about how we approach it. Our role should be supporting, backstopping, providing material or mentorship support, and getting people to, like community members, to be in the front and center of the change process. And as part of process when community members commit to embracing new ideas, new norms, it has to be formalized. It could be through bylaws or formal way of structuring it, so it is sustained. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Naznat. I'm going to hand over now to our second panelist, Giovanna Lauro, who's the Deputy CEO of Equimundo, for her presentation. Giovanna.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Josephine, and hi, everybody. As I share my screen, I wanted to start by thanking UNDP for this invitation and also congratulating the authors of the Gender Social Norms Index of the analysis. It was a super interesting reading preparing for this webinar, and it's lovely to be with these amazing panelists. So I'm gonna present some of our work from Rwanda. Hope you're seeing the slides. Let me know if you're not. Even though it's a specific case study from Rwanda, I think the lessons learned that I will be sharing can really be global. Just as we've heard from NATSNet and their work in Uganda, these are practices that we have adapted with partners across very different contexts, as diverse as Latin America, Europe, North America, because as Pedro was saying at the beginning in his remarks, we are seeing the backlash against gender equality globally. And some of the norms that we are dealing with have a lot of commonalities, even across deeply different contexts. So today, I will present some findings from the evaluation of a gender transformative parenting intervention that we co-created and co-implemented with our partner RAMREC, the Men's Resource Center in Rwanda. The intervention is called Bandebereho, which means role model in Kinyarwanda. And it's at the core, a parenting intervention that really aims at including a strong focus on gender equality, not just from a gender sensitization perspective, but really trying to question gender power dynamics within the family and within the relationship in ways that recall very much some elements of the theory of change that NATSNet explains so eloquently about raising voices. The peculiarity of this intervention is that it focuses specifically on engaging fathers along with their female partners, and so really tries to get men to be more engaged in unpaid care work. Of course, we do not only work with men, we also work with the female partners, and this address maybe one of the issues that we saw in the chat raised by Marth about what do we do when women are also unwilling to support gender equality? What do we do when they have internalized some of those harmful norms? Indeed, one of the elements that we noticed in the first piloting of this kind of intervention that was originally implemented only with men, we were noticing that even as we were successfully changing men's attitudes and behaviors, their female partner were resisting change because they were still living in a society that limits women's agency, and they were perceiving sometimes men's engagement in housework, in caregiving, as actually encroaching what was perceived to be as the women's area of agency. So very important for us to work in what we call gender synchronized way as much as possible. So at the core of this intervention, I was always saying, is a gender transformative parenting intervention. So really focus on promoting positive parenting practices, but also aiming to affect change in other domains, from promoting, for instance, access to maternal, newborn, and child health, and importantly, also focus on changing attitudes and behaviors around violence. Rwanda, as we have heard earlier on, I think Rachel was mentioning in her graph about where we have achieved gender parity politically. We saw that Rwanda actually is the country where there is greatest representation of women in political roles, and yet we see that a lot of the norms that are still very common and deeply entrenched are similar to many other countries where women are faring much worse politically. That is, we see the usual division of roles in terms of men being the breadwinners and women being limited to a role of caregivers, and we see also a lot of violent supportive attitudes both amongst men and amongst women, both in terms of intimate partner violence as well as in terms of violence against children. So this intervention basically works with couples over a period of about 15 weeks, holding sessions both with groups of men as well as about half of the sessions, about 8 sessions, bring in their female partners to really encourage this critical reflection around what it means to be a man, what it means to be a man supporting gender equality, and what are the benefits for men when it comes to be more engaged in the lives of their children, when it comes to be more supportive of their partner in their daily lives. Why are we using fatherhood as an entry point? For multiple reasons. First of all, it's because, as we've heard, the pace towards gender equality is slow, and it's going to continue to be slow unless we share the burden of change with men as well. We cannot continue putting the burden of change only on women's shoulders. We need to get men to get along on this ride, both for gender equality and also because gender equality is good for men themselves. So this is something that we really stress in this intervention. We know for evidence, not just in Rwanda, but globally, that actually men want to be more involved, for instance, in the lives of their children. And we know also that fatherhood is the one entry point where we really can get to change deeply entrenched gender norms, even within adult men, which we know are hard to change otherwise. And also if we think about kind of a sustainability and scalability lens, we know that working around parenthood is the one moment where we can work with the health system. So really thinking about how we change gender norms, gender attitudes, not just at the individual level, but how do we involve institutions and public policy to really get along on this path towards change, as Raquel was saying in her introductory remarks. So the results I'm going to share here briefly today come from a randomized control trial that we conducted with about 1,000 couples, half of which were in a control group that was not receiving the intervention and half of which were receiving the intervention. What's interesting about this randomized control trial is that we collected data not just more or less immediately after the intervention, but we went back 2 years later, and we went back also 6 years later in 2021. So the results that I'm showing really present kind of the sustainability of the impact that we are seeing. And if you Google Bandeberejo, you'll find several scholarly articles, reports, where you can read more about this. But again, for the sake of remaining within the time limits, I wanted to share just a few key highlights from the impact that we've seen. What's most interesting, I think, is that we see that by adding a gender transformative lens to what is at the core of parenting intervention, we can achieve impact among multiple domains, not just parenting practices. That is, the impact that we see, for instance, we saw more equitable couple relations in the form of joint decision-making, more joint decision-making on elements such as financial planning, family planning. We saw less intimate partner violence reported by women, importantly, but also we saw a reduction in violence against children perpetrated by men and perpetrated by women. And importantly, of course, we saw more engagement of men in caregiving and care work broadly, which I think Rihanna was mentioning, the importance of engaging men in care work, seeing care work as one of the barriers that we see today to women's economic empowerment. And so within that context, really, this kind of holistic intervention has the potential to affect gender equality and the norms related to it across multiple domains. Here to give you a sense of the difference between control and treatment group around IPV. Again, we measured it across multiple dimensions in terms of all the forms of IPV. These are data reported by women. And so we see 6 years later, from a statistically significant perspective, an important impact, a sustained impact in terms of reduced IPV rates within the participants. Similarly, we saw also an improvement in parenting practices, a reduction of the use of violence, more support of positive discipline. And also we ask parents about the behavior of their children using internationally agreed upon questionnaires. And so here as well, we saw an improvement in terms of how children were faring in their daily lives. again, we saw, as I was mentioning, an increase of men's participation in the daily care of children, but also in household chores. So not just in the fun task of taking care of children, but also in the daily chores. What's interesting is that even though we saw men on average in the treatment group increase their participation for about 30 minutes per day, women's time spent on caregiving and care work more broadly did not decrease. So I think that's important for future interventions to think about, okay, as we engage men's engagement, how can we support women's diversification of their use of time, not just continuing to do exactly the same amount, because we know that there is a disproportionate burden, of course, of care on women's shoulder. So why are we seeing these lasting impacts? Why are we seeing these impacts even 6 years after the intervention? A couple of ideas here. The first one is that we have been using a gender transformative approach. As Natsat were saying, this kind of intervention, in this kind of interventions, we do not tell men and women what to do, but we really encourage a critical reflection. We really encourage them to think about the impact of certain behaviors, certain norms on their lives. And we do so in a context, in a way that it's contextually appropriate. We do so in a way that does not make this intervention come across as imported, but actually working with local facilitators, trying to understand what are the relevant norms, what is the best language to talk about this. I think somebody in the questions from Iraq was talking about what do we do when we cannot even talk about gender, when gender is banned. And, to some degrees, this is something that we see in other contexts as well, whether it's some states in the US, whether it's the backlash around what we call gender ideology in Italy, where I'm from. So in Rwanda as well, definitely, even in a country where there is a lot of support for gender equality, we were really careful in terms of framing these conversations in a way that resonated with the participants. And of course, again, keeping in mind that Rwanda is a specific country where there is a really strong enabling supportive environment. So calling for more research also in other countries where there may be more challenging environments is really important. But definitely the key lesson here is to really think about including, as we work on gender equality, an explicit focus on fathers to encourage retention and recruitment in the first place of men in these initiatives, to avoid isolating women in their responsibility for the promotion of gender equality. Last slide here. So just thinking about where we go from here and how do we ensure that we move from an approach that for so long in general in our field has seen normative change as a responsibility at the individual level, and actually how do we build that up with institutions. In Rwanda, again, with partners, so far we have reached about 20,000 parents, but we're now working with the Ministry of Health to scale up this intervention by having it delivered by community health workers, with the idea of reaching up to 80,000 parents in the next couple of years, and really thinking about changing not only men's and women's individual attitudes and behaviors, but really starting to promote normative change. I'll stop here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Giovanna and Natsat for bringing these really critical perspectives to the conversations and to this conversation, and really showing us that shifting gender norms is long-term. It's working bottom up, and also crucially, as you were just saying, Giovanna, needs to address the issues of masculinities and the role of men and fathers. So thank you very much. We've been having a very active sort of conversation and debate in the chat and the Q&A, so it just goes to show that these issues can be discussed and needs to be discussed for a long time. But let me bring at least one or two questions from the audience to our panelists. The first one is coming from the Iraqi context, and I would like to invite Aroa to comment on this. So in a context where even the word gender is quite political and quite difficult to approach. How can you work with gender issues and gender norms, and what can and should the UN, the broader UN family, do in these issues? Aroa, any thoughts on this?
Thank you, Josephine, and it's been great listening to also the panelists on the good work in the field. So we are seeing these resistances and this backlash in many countries when even the commonly agreed language that has been agreed internationally by member states is being contested. So even there are some countries that want to go backwards to that. I think that there are different levels, layers that we can work on at the same time. And this is what I see that UNDP is doing together with other UN agencies. One is at the political level, we need to continue having these dialogues, this advocacy, and working with governments to ensure that they implement what they have committed internationally. This is one entry point, but it's not the only entry point. When we work on in the field, we always, of course, we work with governments. They are our main counterpart. But I think that one thing that has been working well is also working with institutions, not at the political level only, at the technical level. So providing capacity development to officials who are working at the ministries, but also in local governments, and working directly with them, raising awareness and also showing that gender equality is positive, and it's positive not only because of gender equality per se, that is the main reason, but also how it brings other multipliers in the economy and in societies. So we see that when we work at the same time at the political level, but also at the technical level, the things start opening up. But I agree with colleagues, this is something that is long, that it takes time. And the third pillar that I think is very important together with these two of capacity development and working at the political level is working with civil society, working with grassroots, because they are the ones that can also help bring this critical mass of the public to request this accountability. And we do have some examples. One good example is in Somalia, where UNDP started working with women religious leaders who were based at the local level. There were 200 women religious leaders, Islamic leaders, who started coming together, and they started working to reduce the extremism and the violent discourses linked to Islam. This was very powerful, and it really started to make an impact. So we see that we cannot use only one entry point. We need to use all the entry points that we can, but obviously we cannot work without the government, so we always need to be working with them. But I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Aroa, for that. We are unfortunately running out of time, but I want to invite all our panelists to reflect very quickly on this interesting question that Chiara Marocchia is bringing up in the Q&A. How can we engage in communication about social biases against women when it comes to these topics that are perceived as private and meant not to be addressed outside of the family? How do we work then with the communication and trying to shifting norms? Let me first give the floor to Giovanna, who's first in my row of little talking heads.
Thank you so much, Josephine. I think probably, and thank you, Chiara, for the question. I think definitely a sequenced approach is really crucial. I was advocating earlier on to try as much as we can to work in gender synchronized way with both men and women, but around certain topics, especially on topics related to violence and the most intimate topics, it's really crucial to have gender segregated groups, leaving a safe space for women and men to talk about those topics that are most challenging for them, to talk about them in a safe environment first, and to start changing their behaviors in a safe place. One very concrete example that we have in Rwanda the taboo around men being engaged in caregiving and even holding children. Something that we did was to have men practice with dolls within a group first, and really get acquainted with the idea of physically holding a baby, and then slowly getting them to do it also with what, you know, norm experts call their reference group, whether it's the family, it's the broader community, it's their peers. So really thinking also from a social science perspective, who are the others that we want to influence? Not coming with our own biases from our own context, but really understanding in this context, who do these participants care about? And really ensuring that our interventions are inspired by sound research in that sense. I'll stop here for the sake of time. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Giovanna. Rachel, any reflections from you on this or the broader discussions we've been having?
Sure, yeah, thank you. It's a great question. They're all great questions. And I would just probably echo Giovanna's point and add, you know, a framework that I found useful from a research perspective is to think about indirect and direct norm confrontation. So often norm contestation can be very jarring. It can prompt violence. So there are some times where indirect approaches that look at peripheral norms. So you might talk about, you know, do women deserve to be beaten in certain cases, or is violence acceptable? That can be a better entry point than should women be a leader, and really thinking about that is useful. And one last quick point, I saw from Natalie a really interesting question about, you know, we've been doing a lot of this for a while, education, policy change, addressing GBV. It's not necessarily new, and I think that's a really important point. But I guess I would say from my perspective in terms of, you know, what's happening, how are we building? I think the evidence base on what works best for norm change, that's really where the future is. So yes, those strategies are great, but in what context, in what sequence, as Giovanna said, what specific type of intervention at a specific moment in time, say in a political transition, or so I think that's where I'd love to see it going. And I think there is good progress to see as well.
Thank you very much. Natsnet, any final, very quick 30-second reflections?
Yeah, I think colleagues have mentioned, but I also want to recognize, like, breaking the silence is also a process. Like, we don't have to expect people to just pull out their private life like day one. It's about building trust and engagement through time. So some key things that we can flag from SASA together is, one, what kind of language do we use? Is it inviting and encouraging? For example, instead of saying gender, the language of power in SASA together has been really powerful to relate with everyone, men and women. We all have power. Even starting with that, like, positive notion that we all have power is really inspiring for people to really rethink. And then the idea of working with community activists, like when these conversations are happening, it's you have that conversation with your friend, your family member, your neighbor, like they are not strangers. So it becomes easier for people to really think about this issue with people they know. And then the third one is, since it is a process, it doesn't have to be, people don't have to say things in the first few conversations. It's about getting them to reflect. You throw that question and leave them to reflect about it. So, like, once they reflect and they digest, I'm sure in the subsequent conversation, there will be some level of openness. So we really have to give ourselves grace to take it as a process. And eventually we will have a safer space where people can bring their most intimate experience into a group conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Natsnet. And thanks to all panelists for joining and for sharing your expertise and the important work you're doing on what is essentially, yes, a long-term process and needs to be bottom up and involve everyone, because we all are part of sharing, carrying these gender social norms, reproducing them, but also then, as Rehanna was alluding to at the end of her presentation, we're all also part of changing and shifting these norms. So thank you again, everyone, for joining these conversations. We could continue for hours on end. It's very important and interesting conversations. We shared some resources in the chat, but also please feel free to reach out to us to continue to be in touch and keep these conversations going. Thank you very much to everyone and have a good day.
Thank you.
You're welcome.